100.
Hello and welcome to Going Bush, the show about our ever-changing forests and the forest industry in southeastern Australia.
And in this, the International Year of the Forest, we have a suitably diverse range of stories. Here's a look at what's coming up on the show.
A new plantation regime that's all the rage in South America, promising high-quality sawlogs through the philosophy of lonely trees.
New science aimed at plugging the gaps in the carbon accounting balance sheet, and a groundbreaking deal that proves four-wheel drives and the environment can get along.
The idea of producing timber from plantations has been around for a long, long time,
Yes.
but for a species like eucalyptus, which is a hardwood and pretty slow growing, the time it takes to get a big, high-quality sawlog has been a huge disincentive.
That's right. In Australia, most of the eucalyptus sawlogs come from native forestry, but in other parts of the world, that simply isn't an option.
Evan Shield is a forestry expert who spent much of the past 20 years helping to pioneer eucalypt plantation techniques in South America.
We must grow eucalypts to get more value out of them, more value per hectare. And the business of growing trees is the business of growing money. And to grow money, I think we have to appreciate that we need nice big trees. And to get nice big trees, we have to apply the right silviculture. So I'm a silvicultural evangelist, if you like, with the eucalypts.
The sermon is espousing the virtues of a relatively new, seemingly radical plantation regime which dictates a massive reduction in the density of plantation trees.
What I'm preaching these days is lonely trees. Trees that are sufficiently separated in space from one another that they need a cell phone to communicate one with the other. Trees that don't compete with one another become fat trees, and fat trees are higher value trees, and that's what we have to do, and we have to do it quickly.
Eucalypt plantations in Tasmania are almost exclusively planted to produce pulpwood. It's biomass operation where the fibre of the trees is important, but not so the form.
So this is your typical plantation. It's a blue gum plantation. It's about 5 years old, and it's planted so there are about 1,100 trees to the hectare. And while that's very good for growing pulpwood, it's less good for growing sawlogs.
Whereas in your plantation with lonely trees, we can be down to as low as 200 trees per hectare. That means that in 25 years' time, the trees are big, fat sawlogs worth much more money.
This Forestry Tasmania stand near Geeveston in the state's south is one of the first Australian attempts at a lonely trees plantation. And the message here is be bold, thin early and prune hard.
I think you have to be careful about the proximity of trees that you leave as retained stems.
Yep.
Here we've got two trees 1.5 metres apart, thereabouts. And up here you've got crowns that are in competition with one another.
Yes.
And this means that the trees are going to grow out, and you'll get growth stresses developed on the inside of these trees. Besides which, when trees compete, they slow down in their diameter growth. So my suggestion would be that one of them would have to go, should have gone, and that you need to keep the trees well separated so that they can grow laterally and uniformly in their crowns.
Yes.
And this means the diameter will follow.
Now, the lonely tree plantation philosophy, Andrew, requires some heavy thinning when the trees are relatively young, and as we understand it, there are a couple of ways to do it.
Nick, you've got to be ruthless. One way is an obvious way, and that's just with a bloke with a chainsaw.
Yep.
Go along, pick out your tree, lop it down. The other way that we're playing around with in Tasmania is ejecting the tree with some sort of poisony substance.
That does it no good.
The tree then falling over in sort of 3 to 4 years' time. There's pros and cons for both. Manual thinning with chainsaws is fairly labour intensive, not to mention hazardous for those in the bush doing the job, while poisoning involves the use of some nasty chemicals and leaves the dead but standing trees in the plantation for a number of years. Both methods are being trialled.
So that way we can compare the different sites, because we've also got to look at the cost. Early work in these plantations means a greater cost at the end because it's money invested early. So we've got to look at the most economic and operationally best way of doing it.
So after the first couple of years in this particular plantation regime, you
Yes.
come through, Hardy, and you pick the trees that you do not like,
Yes.
and you cut them down.
You do, Nick. You thin them out. You've got to be cruel to be kind. These trees that you cut down are actually good for nothing. You can't use them for anything, but by getting rid of them, these trees behind will grow up bigger and stronger and quicker.
These give so that they may grow.
That heavy thinning has other follow-on effects. With the trees spread so far apart in the plantation, grass grows quite happily between them. And once the trees have reached a reasonable size, livestock can be grazed on the pasture to further add to the productivity of the land.
It happens that growing lonely trees under trees on farms policy is a real doddle. It's a piece of cake because it's almost exactly what the farmer wants. He doesn't want a dense mass of shade that precludes co-cropping with pasture, for example. He wants the ability to grow grass underneath trees, and lonely trees suits that ideally. And in fact, in the north of Argentina, there are some brilliant examples of lonely trees and fat cattle going together.